Samantha Ball is an extension educator in Canyon County, located in Caldwell, Idaho, and she's going to talk to us today about rotational grazing techniques. So Samantha, I am just going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours and take over the presentation. And so I'll just let you know that you will need to unmute yourself.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you.
And you can see my screen, is that right?
I can. And now you are in slideshow mode, so that's great.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Like Colette said, I am Samantha Ball. A little bit about myself before I get started. So I actually grew up here in southern Idaho in Kuna. It's about 45 minutes west of Boise. My parents had about 5 acres. We raise about 100 cow-calf pairs of Angus cattle, and those fluffy cows you see, club cattle, they're usually a mix of several breeds. We also have a small herd of those. We have about 30 head of sheep, and we just farrowed out our first sow this year. So obviously 5 acres and 100 cow-calf pairs, that doesn't add up like it makes any sense at all, especially since I told you we had other livestock. So we do a lot of rotational grazing on our land as well as some other people's land that we rent from throughout the year. And then the family I just married into has 400 acres of cropland. So we're working on converting some of that into pasture for my cows so that we can rotational graze that. So hopefully I have some knowledge today for you guys and you guys all take away something. So what is rotational grazing? A lot of times you'll hear it called management intensive grazing. So basically it's the practice of moving livestock between pastures on a regular basis. So instead of just having one big pasture and letting your cattle or any livestock animal roam out there all year long, you break it up into smaller size pastures or pens or paddocks, and you move them from one pen to another on a regular basis. So if you manage your rotational grazing well, it should increase the amount of feed you have throughout the year because you are treating that grass and that land a little bit better by moving those animals more often. And it also should increase the quality of the forage that you are producing. There's a Lost Rivers Grazing Academy that Extension puts on in Salmon, Idaho in the fall every year. And the first thing they said was, we are not livestock growers, we are grass growers first, because if we can't grow grass, we can't grow livestock. So keep that in mind this whole presentation, that we're actually learning how to grow grass, because without it, we can't grow anything else. So rotational grazing, it gives us an extended grazing season, and that's because we're not eating all the grass at once, and the livestock aren't eating down their favorite plants all at one time. It gives us stronger pastures because they have a little bit more time to recuperate. If you remember when you planted your pasture, hopefully you didn't put livestock on right away, that you gave it some time to grow and get itself established, so it was really luscious. And so the same thought is going behind this, is giving that pasture some time to establish itself again after being well grazed. It's grazed more uniformly. So what we're looking at is, a lot of times you'll drive by a pasture and there's grass that is grazed all the way down to the ground. And then there's these little piles of grasses that haven't been touched at all, and they have seed heads on top. So this way we're forcing livestock to eat everything out there equally. They don't have the time to think about what they want to eat. You're forcing them to eat everything. And then those cows can't pick out their favorite grass in that pasture. They're evenly eating every single piece of grass. We have higher quality forage, which I talked about in the last slide, that we're giving these grasses more time to recuperate after being grazed. They have more time to grow and more of a rest time, I guess. We have less weeds. If plants are doing well, the good plants that we want to keep, they will most likely push out those bad plants that we don't want to keep because they're healthy and able to do that. A lot of times when people do move from traditional grazing, just having one big pen with all the animals in it, to rotational grazing, people end up with extra land to grow hay on. Actually, due to my marriage recently, we ended up with this. Since we started dating, we've been rotational grazing on some of the pasture that my husband's family owns. And last year we were able to actually hay about 20 acres of ground that we were originally rotational grazing. So it's a learning thing every year. At the end of this presentation, I'll tell you that it's not perfect the first time. It's definitely a learning curve. So what are some of the advantages of rotational grazing? I talked about increased forage production, and who doesn't want more free food, right? We don't need to be buying extra feed to get through the winter if we can grow it ourselves. We're going to have a healthier soil just because we are allowing those plants to get those roots that are going down further, or allowing those nitrogen fixing plants to put nitrogen back into the soil. And we're not stamping on that ground as much because livestock aren't out there 24/7. It allows for less compaction. There's less waste because we're forcing those animals to eat what is available. We're not giving them the choice to pick and choose their favorites. Just like children or adults, I would say is the same thing. If you gave them a plate that had a piece of cake on it or green beans, more times than not, they're going to choose that piece of cake. And the same goes for livestock. They have taste buds too, and they're going to pick what they think tastes best. So by forcing them to eat in a smaller area, they're not going to be less picky about what they get, so you're going to waste less grass. We're going to reduce soil compaction. A lot of this is people irrigate, and livestock are still out there because they have nowhere else to put them. Wet grounds are easier to compact. So by being able to rotate and move these animals off the grounds, we're going to have less compaction. We're going to be able to control those undesirable plants. Like I said, our good plants are going to stay, and they're going to push out those bad plants that we don't want because they're going to be stronger than if we did traditional grazing. We can also extend our grazing season by rotational grazing. This is because we give that those plants longer time to recoup from being grazed. And a lot of times you can actually graze all the way through winter if you have a good setup, because any trained livestock animal can eat the grass that's under the snow. That snow is an insulation for the grass, so you will be feeding less hay or paid for feed for those animals throughout the winter. And improved animal management. So you're going to be out there with those animals a lot more by rotational grazing than traditional grazing, because you are going to be moving them on a regular basis. So they're going to be a little more easier to manage. So you'll be moving them more often. It'll become a routine thing for them. So when you do have to, ship them off to the sale yards or the butcher, or you're just bringing them in to vaccinate, it will be easier because they are used to being worked on a regular basis. So there's not one size fits all. I started my job about 1.5 years ago, and the first thing I was told is that it's okay to not know the answer, and a lot of times the answer will be it depends. And this sucks as an educator because we do want to get you guys the best answer in the quickest way possible, but a lot of times there are lots of factors that go into this. So I can't just give you guys this speech and you all are going to go and do the same exact thing at home and they're all going to work perfectly, because it really is a unique for every person. So what are some of the variables that come into this? The first thing I want to talk about is climate. We live in Idaho, so the climate is ever changing. It could be raining one day and it could be sunny the next. So plants obviously like water. Photosynthesis happens with the sun. So these are important things, and this is ever changing throughout the year. Seasons are different all across the nation and the world, and even within the state of Idaho. Some of us have a longer winter. Some of us have warmer summers. So it all kind of depends on what your seasons are. Rainfall. If you don't irrigate, you're hoping that you get good rainfall. If you don't get good rainfall, this will affect how much your grass is going to grow. And some people irrigate so they can do this on their own without hoping that the climate is perfect. The number of paddocks. So how many pens or pastures are you going to have? So we talked about going from the traditional one big pen with all the animals to cutting those up into smaller pens. What are going to be the size of those paddocks? This is obviously going to be different. Most of you are small acreage, so this could be anywhere from less than an acre to 100 acres. So obviously I can't break up the same acre in the way I would do the 100 acres. I'm going to have a lot more space to break them up differently. Susceptibility of livestock. You do have to train them. And it's going to take some time. Once you get the bulk of them trained, the rest will follow. And this is pretty much true for all. You're always going to have that knothead that doesn't want to listen, but it will take some time to train them. This isn't going to be a perfect, let's set up rotational grazing today and go with it. It'll take some time. It's going to depend on what kind of forage you have. And this is also going to depend on your area. There are going to be some plants that do better in your area. But in general, we want to have more than 5 varieties of plants. And if we can get a couple legumes in there like alfalfa or clover to help put those nitrogen fixing plants back in. And then how much do you have? And we want to make sure that there's a good spread of these plants. And then are you going to need a supplemental feed? So some people are going to supplement feed just to give their pastures a longer rest period. And this can be, on the rotation, that the 5th rotation you do is going to be supplemental feed. Some people are going to rotational graze all summer and do supplemental feed in the winter. And some people might not have to do supplemental feed at all. So it's different for everyone, and that's something you'll have to decide for your production. But often you get some good things out of this. It seems like a lot of work in the beginning, but hopefully you won't be buying as much feed, if any at all. And a lot of times we see reduced parasite control because many of the parasites we deal with in livestock, their life cycles are less time than how long we are waiting to come back to rotational graze. So they are dead before our cattle can come back or livestock can come back and pick them up again. So we've been seeing a lot less parasites in our livestock because of that. So it's also going to be different based on what animals you're grazing. We rotational graze our cattle and sheep together. We don't rotational graze our hog. And everyone's going to be a little different. Some of you are just going to have sheep. Some are going to have a mixture of species. Some of you might be following up with some type of bird. So it's all going to be different from person to person. So it's important to know those livestock and how they graze so that you can have the best rotational grazing program possible for your production. So forage use, I was talking about rotational grazing, and continuous grazing is that traditional grazing I'm talking about. So I'm debating what is best for you. In general, the best thing to do this by is take half, leave half. So you're thinking, okay, I split up all my pasture land into smaller paddocks. How do I know when to move my animals? So we want to take half of it and leave the other half. So when you move your animals out there, you're going to need to see how much grass is actually out there in forages. So that might be measuring with a measuring stick, walking out there saying it's knee high, figuring out how much it is so that you know when it's ready to move those animals again. And it's important to do so because if we follow the take half, leave half, those grasses are going to do better. If we graze them for too long, those grasses are going to have less roots. They're going to die off, and our pasture's not going to look as good. If we continuous graze, they're going to graze all the way down to the ground, and it's going to take longer and be harder for those plants to recoup. So this is just a picture of plant roots and how they're directly related to what's on top of the ground. So what we see is a mirror of what's under the ground. So the more that's on top is the more roots that you would have seen in the bottom. So grasses need nitrogen. So this can be done in a couple different ways. You can apply a nitrogen fertilizer to your pastures to feed the plants, or you can have legumes in those pastures that help put the plant's available nitrogen back into the soils for those grasses to use. I recommend always doing a soil test to see how much nitrogen you need to do, because there's no sense in wasting your money on a nitrogen application if those plants are getting what they need. And then that last bullet is just a couple common legumes that will put nitrogen back into the ground for plants to use. So this is just another graph that shows what happens if you graze it down very low and what happens if you do it too long. So if you graze it too far to the ground, it's a smaller plant. If you let it grow to a seed head, you're going to have a harder time forcing those animals to eat it because it's not as palatable to them. So you want that nice in between from a baby plant to the full-grown flowering seeding plant. Stalking rates. All right, I'll try and hurry because I think I'm going over time. So stalking rates are going to depend on what livestock animal you are going to be raising. There is an equation that you can use to figure out how many animals per unit that you will be, so how many animals you would put in that pen. If you can look up online, there are lots of videos to help you with this and resources, and I'm happy to help you guys figure that out also. If you guys want to call my office or shoot me an email, I would be happy to help. So carrying capacity is the stalking rate at which animals perform and eat the grass. So how much feed is actually there for them to eat. And then stalking rate is how much feed you're going to take away. And you want those to be pretty equal, because if you take away too much feed, then there's zero or negative left. Those plants aren't going to come back well. If you don't eat enough when you come back to rotational graze the second time, those plants have gone into their adult or seedling stage and they're less palatable. So stalking density, the more animals you have in an area, the less selectivity you're going to have. So if I have 1 acre with 100 sheep on it, they're not going to be selective about what they eat. They're just going to eat whatever's there. If I have one animal on 100 acres, it's going to be very selective because it has all this space and no one else to compete with. So they're going to take their time and pick the best one out. The more animals you have in a smaller area, you're going to have a better distribution of their manure for those nutrients for the soil. A lot of times in our traditional grazing, they poop by the shade or up by the water trough. So by having it so that they're forced to eat throughout, they have to kind of compete more. They're going to poop wherever, and so this is going to leave those nutrients scattered throughout the pasture. So I was just talking stalking rate versus stalking density. So this is just a fun graph. I've seen where these sheep actually move and eat before, so I'm sorry they're not actually eating for you guys. But the difference between 1 acre, 1 animal for 100 days, or 1 acre with 100 animals in 1 day. They're going to be a lot less selective when there's more in there because they're having to compete with the others. So they're not going to pick out the best ones, and it's going to be more evenly grazed. Like I said, there's not one size fits all for rotational grazing. So these are some examples of paddocks that you could have. Remember, you have to be able to, the livestock have to be able to get to water no matter where they're at. So I've seen where some people have a water trough in every single paddock. Some of them have one water trough, and the animals have to walk to that area if it's through an alleyway, or all of the paddocks come to one central point in the middle and they can reach the water trough from all of the pastures. So in sample 1, that would be more what I'm talking about, where they all come to a central location in the middle. And then the second one are just normal square pins that are, there's an alleyway for them to get to the water. And then the third one is just several different pins that they rotate through, just like the square one in the middle. So why have this an area that's not grazed? This is to protect pastures from damage. So I talked about earlier, you might have a rotation that is a supplemental feed, or in the winter you have to supplemental feed. So basically what we want to do in that time is we don't want to feed that supplemental feed in their pastures, if at all possible. We want to have a different area that isn't growing forages productively for you to do these things. This helps reduce compaction out in your pastures because that's where you have the most production. It's an area that's dry for the animals to get away from something. So like if you're irrigating your pasture, you want those animals off there to reduce compaction. And so by having this sacrificial area for them to go to, it provides more time for those plants to grow. So pasture poultry, I don't want to go too in depth on this, but we did have a question about it earlier because I think our next guest speaker is talking about their pasture poultry. So the question was asked, how much room? So here's your answer: 5 square feet per bird. Some of the advantages of pasture poultry, it does save on feed. I am not confident that you could sustainably and quickly fulfill the need of a market bird to weight just solely on pasture rotation grazing, just because it'll take longer and those birds aren't going to get as much nutrients from the grass, but they're also going to help disperse nutrients when they're out there. So a lot of times people follow poultry after a larger livestock species, which McIntyre Farms does. And when they do this, they're going to go through and they're going to take that manure that those animals dropped and they're going to disperse it even more readily available for those plants to use to help it get into the soil quicker. So a lot of times, and this is for most livestock, they're more active in the mornings and evenings. So if you can rotate them at those times, those would be best. I've also seen where people bring them in at night to like a sacrificial area and then take them out to the pastures in the morning and bring them in the evenings. Again, you have to train all livestock species. This isn't going to be something that your chickens just know that that's what you want them to do. You're going to have to train them. The cooler it is in the pastures, the more likely the chickens are going to be out there grazing. So having shade, if there's close water sources for them, and obviously they always need clean water, but it needs to be fairly close so that they're not hot out there. And then we want shorter forage, because if your grass is 2 feet high, they're going to have a hard time trudging through that. So you want to rotate these chickens in right after you've gotten those larger livestock species through. Fencing. This is going to be different for every livestock species. And on the next slide, I have several maybe not, in a couple slides, I have several different species and how high the fences need to be for them. So when you're doing rotational grazing, you do want to have a perimeter fence that is permanent, something that's very solid, because your grass is going to be greener on your side, and you don't want neighbor animals to get in, but you also want to make sure if something gets out of a non-permanent fence that they are still within your property. So these are just a couple types of fencing systems that you can use. They don't have to be anything super fancy. When you do a permanent fence rotational grazing, so you're going to keep these pastures the same throughout the year, you're just going to move the livestock. It can be just a single strand. But if you're going to change these fences, we recommend portable fencing. So that means you're going to have one big pasture and you're going to have portable fencing that you move with the livestock instead of having permanent fixtures. And again, this is just one strand. You do have to train livestock for this so that they don't get out. So these are just the interior fencings that we're talking about, permanent versus semi-permanent and temporary. So that outside fence, always permanent in case anything gets out, and you also don't want your neighbors coming over to eat your nice green grass. But those inner pens, it's up to you and how it'll work best for your production. If you get new livestock every year, you might want more permanent fencing so they don't get out. If you get different size livestock, so we have sheep, cattle, and pigs, so we have a temporary because each one of them uses something different, and they don't all need the same size pen. So here was that post I was talking about that shows the different height requirements for the different species, so you guys can look back at that later. And I have 1 minute left, so I'm doing great. So this last thing is, growth is a process of trial and error. It's experimentation. So this isn't going to be perfect the first time. It's going to take time to learn what's going to be best for you, because everyone is different. You might need to do a higher stocking density, smaller pastures. You might need to rotate more often or less. You might be rotating your livestock every single day. Some people only rotate every other day or once a week. So it's going to be different for you and how many animals you have and the space you have to do it in. So do you guys have any questions for me before our next speaker comes on?
We do have a couple of questions, Samantha. The first question is, are there periods of the day when new growth is too rich for horses?
Yes. So in general, that's in the morning. So with rotational grazing horses, a lot of times people put them out in the afternoon and have them locked up in the morning, just so that they don't colic or anything.
Okay, great. Are there any other animals that have that same issue?
Not for cattle, sheep, or goats. I'm not as confident in birds. Chickens should be fine, but I like other bigger birds like ostrich and stuff. I'm not confident in saying yes or no.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
The second question we have is about access to water. And can water be designed to serve poultry and larger livestock?
A lot of times, no. So the first thing would be, as most of the time, like if you have cattle or sheep or goats, they're going to have a higher water trough, whereas those chickens, you want it to be lower to the ground. If it is a higher trough, you're more likely to have those chickens pooping in the trough, and they're going to be carrying zoonotic diseases that your livestock may get, and so you don't want them to be drinking that poopy water. So you do want to have those two separate. And a lot of times you're going to have cattle grazing in a pasture, and then you'll bring in the chickens. So your cattle will be in a different pasture at the time your chickens are out there. So you'll want two different water sources for them because they'll be in different areas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question, what percent of legumes in pasture would be too much that it would actually or could cause bloat?
10% is about the range you want to have for the animal's likability. You most likely are going to have to add nitrogen at that point, but to reduce the chances of bloat, 10% is a good goal out of your whole pasture to have as forage or as legumes.
Okay, great. And then what about micronutrients in grass-fed operations? Is there some type of testing or some place that people would go for resources around micronutrients and whether or not there might be deficiencies in their pastures?
Yes, so you should always have mineral supplements out in rotational grazing. Um, you, I, I would recommend talking to your vet for the species and breed that you have in your rotational grazing, but you do need to have those micronutrients out for them because they're more likely not to get as much because of the rotational grazing.
Okay, great. Thank you for that great presentation. And those were all of the questions we have.
Awesome.
I do want to remind all of our participants that there will be handouts with all of these presentation slides on the student webpage. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and introduce our next speaker.